What's up guys? In today's video we're going to talk about how to find your macros. Now, of all the videos that I've made, I've never talked about how to find your macros. Most of my stuff is meant for usually higher level people that are involved in the sport, but this video is going to be for the people out there who are wondering, what macros should I be on? What are macros even? So we're going to help you determine these things and find out what you can, what numbers that you should be on. So first, macros, or macronutrients as they're less likely to be called, are carbs, proteins, and fats. So those make up the three macronutrients, and those three macros make up the foods that we intake. Some foods are only carbs, some foods are only fats, some foods are only protein, but most have some of each in it. Now, how to find where your macros should be? Well, when people talk about finding out where their macros should be, they're really referring to where your metabolic intake sits. And in other videos I did talk about people have different metabolic rates, they have different metabolic intakes. So when you're trying to find out your set macros, you can't necessarily look at other people's. You have to find out where you currently sit. So some things that influence your current metabolic rate are the amount of activity that you are doing, your age, your sex, the amount of muscle mass that you have, so things like that. But that's not necessarily going to help you to find out how much food you should be intaking. And there are apps out there that can help you determine your basal metabolic rate, essentially helping you determine like your baseline caloric needs for the day. While those are great, they do just give a rough estimate of what you could potentially be intaking. So if you're out there and if you are looking to hone your nutritional guides, I would recommend having you take a rough intake of what you eat on a normal day. So I usually have people who have never tracked macros before track for about 3, 4, or even 5 days to see how much they're eating, because really that's what's going to be the biggest factor. You can't type anything into a calculator that's going to help you determine what you're eating unless you start writing it down on pen and paper or use some kind of a tracking app like My Macros Plus or MyFitnessPal. But for people out there that are just getting into it, I would really encourage you to write it down on with pen and paper, because that's going to help you look at things a little bit differently. It's one thing to scan via an application a barcode, but it's another thing to spin around a food label and analyze how much carbs are in it, how much fat's in it, how much protein is in it. So then when you have your 3 to 5 days of tracking, then you take the average. So you would look at, on average, how many grams of protein you had a day. On average, how many grams of carbs did you eat per day. And on average, how many grams of fat that you ate per day. And then you have your numbers to go off of. And now this is only an estimate, because usually when people start to track their intake, they are a lot more cognizant of what they're taking in. Like I said, when people spin around the food label, they start to realize actually what is in food and what has more calories and what has less calories, what has more fat, what has less fat, what has more carbs, what has less carbs, what actually has a decent amount of protein and what has no protein in it at all. So when people start to get a little bit more cognizant, they're learning. They're in that learning process, and they start eating a little bit healthier, even though they probably don't intend to do it on purpose. Once you get that average, then you have to be as diligent as possible over the next so many days. So if you set your numbers at one point in time, these aren't the end-all, be-all numbers for the rest of your life, as most of us know, because things change along the way. our body might adapt to the numbers. We might be overeating, we might be undereating. So it's more of a wait and see. You have to be diligent to stick to the numbers because if you don't, then it's going to throw off the whole system. And this is where some people don't like to track macronutrients because it involves work. It's not a set quote-unquote diet where you only eat specific foods. It's another level. It's knowing what is actually in your food and making adjustments accordingly. So after a while, depending on if your weight goes up or goes down, you're going to make changes to those macronutrients. But when you are making changes to those macronutrients, you're essentially just making changes to the overall calories. So I didn't mention this at the beginning of the video, which is important to know, but per gram, carbohydrates and protein have 4 calories respectively per gram. Fat, on the other hand, carries more calories per gram. It's 9 calories per gram. So you can see if you want to make a larger decrease to your numbers, to your overall calorie intake, then maybe decreasing fat would be, it would leave more room in order if you want to take that away. But you have to have some fat in there to help with digestion, to help with satiation, so you can't just remove all the fat, and you can't just remove all the carbs, and you can't just remove all the protein. So that's when a slight dialing back of everything is a little bit more in order. So in closing, when you hear people talk about their macros and what macros they're on, they're essentially counting calories. When you count macros, you're counting calories because remember, those macros equal a number. So, carbs and fat is 4, carbs and protein is 4, and fat is 9. And that's where people kind of get this confusion, is really if you're tracking your macros per se, you're tracking your calories. And yes, there is another level of, getting certain ratios of carbs, proteins, and fats for people, especially for someone like myself who is more or less of a performance athlete, a bodybuilder who's trying to pack on a lot of muscle. So I'm probably taking in more protein than your average person. I'm probably taking in more carbohydrates than your average person would because mine are physique-driven goals. But for your average person out there, you can get away with taking in, on average, a little bit lower of protein than a bodybuilder. And you could probably get away with eating a little bit more fat than I probably would. But it's all about sticking to those set numbers for an extended period of time, weighing yourself, and making an adjustment accordingly. And that's the thing, you can't expect you to get results if you don't stick to the numbers, because at the end of the day, if you're not sticking to the diet, if you're not sticking to your calories, then you can't make changes accordingly. So it's all about being informed on what you're eating and making an informed decision based off of what you see with the scale and or visually. So that's it, guys. I wanted to keep this short and sweet and to the point about tracking macros. As always, guys, keep dominating every aspect. I'll see you soon.